If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in this inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and angry dogs, making their mock of our accursed lot. Like men we will face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. Claude McKay wrote the poem If We Must Die after a series of attacks against black Americans in the United States in the summer of 1919. Author James Weldon Johnson coined the term Red Summer to describe those events. A century ago, hundreds of black Americans were killed in attacks all across the country, and yet the nation has built few memorials to those dead. The Red Summer of 1919 deserves to be remembered. 1919 was somewhat of a turning point for the United States. The First World War ended in November 1918. Veterans returned to America that was rapidly changing. Women would soon gain the right to vote, and Prohibition would begin an experiment in banning alcohol. The Army during the First World War was segregated, and some black regiments were put under French command because white American officers were not comfortable commanding black troops. Many white Americans blamed the coming tragedy on the French for treating black soldiers as equals and planting ideas in their heads. Called soldiers of democracy, black veterans came back to the United States ready to demand civil rights. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, We return from fighting, we return fighting." For black Americans, 1919 marked 300 years since the first African slaves were brought to the American colonies, and they had begun to start calling for change. 1919 was a time of anxiety in the United States and the world. The First World War had ended, but other social movements and economic conditions contributed to an anxious time. Inflation was rising. Labor strikes were common. In Russia, the Bolsheviks had overthrown the Tsar. Americans feared Bolshevik agitation might come to their shores. Anarchist bombings were common. The economy was in flux, and in northern cities, white residents were afraid of the new black migrants bringing economic competition. The Great Migration would eventually send millions of black Americans to the industrial North and Midwest, fleeing violence, segregation, and lack of economic opportunity in the South. Unfortunately, they were sometimes greeted with the same in places where they relocated. While they were at first unconcerned, Southern employers eventually worried about the loss of cheap labor, worked to stem the tide of the exodus. From spring into fall of 1919, these tensions exploded into a series of violent episodes that killed hundreds of black Americans. Served as a wake-up call, but it also spurred a movement in which blacks in America fought back, sometimes for the first time. An early episode of violence occurred in Jenkins County, Georgia, in April. A black church party was interrupted when two white officers arrested a black man named Edmund Scott for possession of a pistol. A wealthy black farmer named Joe Ruffin offered to pay his fine, but the officers demanded cash instead of a check. When Ruffin tried to pull Scott to the car, an officer struck Ruffin with his pistol, which discharged, knocking Ruffin unconscious. Ruffin's son, an Army veteran, thinking his father was dead, shot and killed one of the officers in retaliation. In the ensuing gunfight, the second officer was wounded and then beaten to death. As news spread, what was described as hundreds of white men rushed into the town, bent on revenge. Joe surrendered to the local sheriff, who protected him from a mob bent on lynching. But the mob caught and lynched two of his sons, as well as another black man who had been in the area. They also burned the church and 6 other black churches, as well as 3 black Masonic lodges in the area. Ruffin was led to another county by the sheriff and put in jail there. Repeated attempts to try him for murder or manslaughter finally failed, but he was left impoverished from his legal expenses, moved to South Carolina, as it would not have been safe in Georgia. No charges were ever filed against any of the men who killed Ruffin's sons or destroyed property. On July 19th, in Washington, D.C., a white woman was jostled on the street by 2 black men. One of the men was questioned by police and released, but a rumor started among some white Army veterans that the man had committed rape. A white mob started a 4-day riot, attacking and beating hundreds of black individuals and damaging businesses. When the city's police refused to intervene, black Americans fought back and defended their neighborhoods with firearms. There were shootings and attack from both sides, as President Woodrow Wilson finally sent 200 Army troops to intervene, although heavy summer rains may have done more to quell the riot than the troops. When it finally ended, July 25th, as many as 40 people had died from gunshot wounds or in street fights. At least 150 were injured. In Chicago, Illinois, a week-long riot was set off on July 27th when a black teenager named Eugene Williams hanging onto a makeshift raft, unknowingly floated into the white part of an unofficially segregated Southside beach on Lake Michigan. A white man threw rocks at Williams and other black swimmers to drive them away. Williams was hit in the forehead, knocking him into the water, where he drowned. When black witnesses tried to get the man who threw the rock arrested, the police did nothing, and when the bystanders complained, a fight broke out between white and black mobs, and spread into 5 days of general rioting. While there was violence on both sides, the vast majority of the acts of murder, arson, and property damage were perpetrated by white gangs against black residents on Chicago's South Side. Police did little to protect the black neighborhoods, and the state's attorney accused the police of arresting African-American rioters while refusing to arrest white rioters. Illinois was forced to call in the militia to restore order. 23 black and 15 white residents were killed in the rioting. 500 more were injured. More than 1,000 black families were left homeless due to arson. The black men who fought back in D.C. and Chicago were often returning veterans of the First World War. They had military training, were ready to defend themselves and their families. It marked a difference from riots of previous years when blacks were attacked and mostly could not or did not defend themselves. The violence made one veteran, Harry Haywood, say he realized, "I had been fighting the wrong war. The Germans weren't the enemy. The enemy was right here at home." Economic tensions also impacted events at a riot in Omaha, Nebraska at the end of September. 2 years previous to the riot, a local meatpacking plant had brought in black workers as strikebreakers, and that had caused tension between them and white working-class people of the town. When a black man was accused of raping a white woman, a mob of as many as 10,000 descended on the courthouse, demanding the police turn over the man. The mob set fire to the courthouse and captured and tried to hang the mayor. They also destroyed private property, attacking black neighborhoods and stores. Eventually, the police, surrounded in the burning building, had no choice but to hand the man, named Will Brown, to the mob, who lynched him and burned his body. A young Henry Fonda witnessed the lynching and said it had a profound effect on him. Federal troops finally quelled the riot. 120 people were arrested for their involvement, but most were never successfully prosecuted, and all were eventually released without serving prison sentences. The deadliest episode in the Red Summer started September 30th in Elaine, Arkansas. A union of black sharecroppers was meeting with farmers to discuss how to obtain fairer settlements from white landowners, who they argued had been exploiting the farmers. The planters did not want to pay higher wages, and rumors insinuated that communists were behind the unrest, reflecting larger tensions in the United States as many Americans feared the Russian Revolution was coming to their shores. When 2 armed white deputies showed up at the meeting, they clashed with armed Union guards. It's never been determined who shot first, but a white deputy was killed. The local sheriff called for a posse to arrest those responsible for the killing. Spurred by rumors and sensational headlines about a planned insurrection, a mob of over 1,000 white men descended on the county, indiscriminately killing black men, women, and children. Estimates vary, but between 100 to more than 500 black people were murdered by the mob. The governor called in federal troops who disarmed both sides, but arrested and held 285 black residents. The governor established a committee of prominent white residents who, without interviewing any of the sharecroppers, concluded that the riot was caused by socialist agitators. Despite the widespread murders of black residents, an all-white grand jury indicted no white people and instead indicted 122 black men in connection with the riot. Arkansas had used poll taxes to disenfranchise most black voters, thus removing them from the jury pool, and the black men were tried by all-white juries, often accused with evidence from witnesses who were coerced, in trials where armed white mobs were outside and sometimes even inside the courtroom. 12 men, called the Arkansas 12, were convicted of murder, sentenced to death. Eventually, the U.S. Supreme Court vacated 6 of those convictions on the grounds that the mob atmosphere and coerced testimony denied the men due process. The other 6 were given indefinite furloughs by outgoing Governor Thomas McCrae and taken out of state to prevent their execution. Most modern researchers discount the assertion that there was a planned insurrection or any plan to target white planters for murder, but a conference held in 2000 to review the facts of the event found that the claim appears to be still widely believed. While these represent a few of the more violent events of the Red Summer, they are just a few of the more than 25 riots, massacres, and lynchings that occurred across the United States in the late spring into the fall of 1919. In the aftermath of the Red Summer, Dr. George Haynes, a sociologist employed by the Wilson administration, published a report in the New York Times and other newspapers. It was a call to action about the epidemic of lynchings. The report concluded that from 1889 to 1918, more than 3,000 black people had been lynched in the United States. The report highlighted that states rarely prosecuted the perpetrators of the lynchings and showed little motivation to address the problem of lynchings. He warned that unchecked mob violence creates hatred and intolerance, making impossible free and dispassionate discussion not only of race problems, but questions on which races and sections differ. In such a state of mind, Dr. Haynes wrote, a trivial incident can precipitate a riot. Haynes' report largely fell on deaf ears. The government and news media largely attempted to frame black resistance to the violence of the Red Summer as derived from socialist agitators. The government provided evidence to the media to support his assertion that political organizations were urging blacks to embrace communism. They said that unions were spreading propaganda to breed racial hatred and accused W.E.B. Du Bois of editorializing about socialism. Others, including future FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, blamed black radicals while ignoring white perpetrators of violence. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender told a different story. Journalists like Ida B. Wells investigated the attacks and got the story out that blacks were sometimes justified in fighting. There was some progress. The Supreme Court decision in Moore v. Dempsey, which effectively freed the Arkansas 12, represented a significant shift in policy towards a wider use of federal writs of habeas corpus to oversee state court convictions and represented stricter scrutiny by the Supreme Court of state criminal trials in terms of their compliance with the Bill of Rights. But the largest effect of the violence of the Red Summer was on the black community. Throughout the Red Summer, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had been contacting government officials to raise the alarm, but they were mostly met with indifference, sometimes outright hostility. The NAACP had been formed after the 1908 Springfield, Illinois race riot. In those days, it was led by prominent white supporters of black civil rights. After the Red Summer, black Americans emerged as the leaders of the NAACP and began directing the legal and political advocacy that would lead to success in the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century. By the early 1920s, membership had increased to 100,000 from just 9,000 before the First World War. 100 years later, the nation is still trying to come to grips with the events of the Red Summer. The violence is largely forgotten, even in communities where it occurred. People have been afraid to bring it up for fear that it would raise new tensions, or maybe just because they didn't want to face the past. Chicago is hosting a number of historical events this summer to help the city remember this nearly forgotten chapter in its history. And for the first time, 100 years later, a memorial is being built to the victims of the Elaine, Arkansas massacre, though not in Elaine, in nearby West Helena. In April, a willow tree was planted in Elaine to memorialize those victims, and in August, in the night, someone came and chopped it down, a sign that not everybody wants to remember the past. There are very few historical markers to the violence of the Red Summer in the United States. To most Americans, it is just forgotten history, even though it was the beginning of an awakening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.